Hey, everyone! Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, get ready for something a little different today. We're diving into some truly strange and chilling experiences, stories that will make you question what's real and what's just in our heads. If you've ever encountered something you couldn't explain, you're in the right place. Stick around till the end, because I promise, it's going to get intense. And before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more eerie tales. Let's get started. My name is Cherry. I worked as a nurse in a small rural hospital for about 2 years. I had always been the type to handle stressful situations well, but there was one night on my shift that still haunts me, no matter how much I try to rationalize it. The hospital wasn't much to look at, old, with narrow hallways and rooms that smelled of antiseptic and something else, something I couldn't quite place. The walls had a faded, yellowish hue that made the place feel even older than it really was. The building was one of those places that, despite having a decent number of staff, felt eerily empty at night. Most of the patients were either asleep or too out of it to make a sound, and it seemed like time slowed down, leaving the hospital eerily silent. I was working the night shift when it all began. It had been an uneventful night so far, just the usual routine of checking on patients, administering medications, and logging information. But around 2 a.m., everything shifted. The atmosphere in the hospital suddenly felt heavier, as though the weight of the air itself had increased. I was in the patient ward, making my rounds, when I noticed the light at the far end of the corridor flickering. The light wasn't anything new, old bulbs tended to act up in that hospital, but this one, it flickered in a way that seemed deliberate, almost like it was trying to get my attention. I thought nothing of it at first. I continued on my rounds, checking in on the patients who were still awake, adjusting their 4 drips and offering them water if they needed it. As I walked past the flickering light again, a strange feeling washed over me. It felt as though the light wasn't just malfunctioning, but like it was drawing me in, urging me to come closer. I turned my head, trying to dismiss the feeling as exhaustion or stress. But as I took another step forward, I noticed something strange. The door to room 207, one that had been locked and vacant for weeks, was slightly ajar. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave that room. I approached cautiously. The door creaked open as I pushed it, revealing a completely dark room, despite the hallway light flickering just outside. I stepped inside, squinting my eyes to adjust to the darkness. But then, I heard something. It was faint, almost inaudible at first, but it was definitely there, soft, slow breathing. It was coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Room 207 had been vacant since the last patient was discharged months ago. No one should have been in there. Slowly, I reached for the light switch by the door, flicking it on. The room was empty, save for the old bed with a pristine white sheet, untouched. The breathing had stopped, but the air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. I backed out of the room, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? No. It wasn't possible. I could hear it, clearly. But there was nothing there. As I turned to leave, I heard the soft sound of footsteps, light, almost silent, approaching from behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see another nurse, but the corridor was completely empty. The footsteps stopped as soon as I looked back, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I left the hallway as quickly as I could, heading to the break room. It was quieter there, though the silence felt suffocating. I tried to calm my nerves, telling myself I was just tired. but the strange sounds from room 207 and the sensation of being followed lingered in my mind. A few hours later, my shift was nearly over. I went back to check on the same patients I had seen earlier, but something was off about the place. The hallway felt colder. The lights seemed dimmer. I tried to shake it off, but as I approached room 207 again, I noticed something else. The door was wide open now. I hadn't opened it. Curiosity, and a growing sense of dread, pulled me toward the room once more. This time, I didn't hear any breathing or footsteps, but the air was even heavier. I checked the chart again. The patient listed for that room had been transferred to another hospital weeks ago, so why was the door open? Why was it still giving off such a strange, unsettling vibe? I stepped inside again. The room felt like it was alive, vibrating with some strange energy I couldn't explain. The bed was still made, but the curtains at the window were moving, despite there being no breeze. They fluttered as if something unseen was causing them to sway gently. I walked over to the window and closed the curtains, but the movement stopped immediately. I didn't stay in that room for long after that. I left, feeling more uneasy than ever, and decided to finish my rounds quickly. But as I passed the nurse's station, I glanced down the hallway again. The flickering light at the far end of the corridor had stopped. The light was now steady, but the silence that followed was the most deafening thing I'd ever heard. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept hearing faint sounds, the creak of floorboards, the shuffle of footsteps. In the darkness of my own room, I could almost feel the presence of someone walking behind me, though when I turned around, no one was there. I never spoke about it to anyone at the hospital. Maybe they would have thought I was imagining things, or perhaps they had experienced similar events and didn't want to acknowledge them. But I know what I felt that night, and I'm certain it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. There was something in that hospital that I couldn't explain, something that made the very air feel wrong, and the rooms feel like they were never truly empty. Even now, when I think back to that night, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was there, whatever I heard and felt, wasn't something that belonged in a hospital at all. I left the hospital not long after that. I don't know if it was the building itself or something else entirely that I encountered that night, but I can't bring myself to go back there. Sometimes, I still hear the faint echo of those footsteps, and I wonder if they're following me. My name is Tina. I've been a nurse for almost a decade, and I've worked in various hospitals, but nothing quite prepared me for the night I had to spend in the old wing of the hospital where I was working at the time. It was one of those places where you'd think the building itself had its own strange life. Every creak, every shift in the walls felt like a whisper from a forgotten past. There's one particular night that I still can't explain, no matter how many times I try to dismiss it as mere imagination. It was around midnight when my shift started. I was assigned to work in the older part of the hospital, which most staff avoided because of its outdated facilities and dim lighting. The hallways were narrow, and the rooms were old-fashioned with beds that looked like they hadn't been replaced in decades. The hospital was small, not many patients in that wing, mostly the elderly and a few long-term cases. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was that kind of quiet where you feel like something is just waiting to break it. I was checking in on a patient, a frail old man in room 304, who had been on a ventilator for weeks. He had no family and hardly responded to anything. I'd been his nurse for a few days, and every time I checked on him, it was the same, silent, unmoving, as if you were just a shell left behind. That night, when I entered the room, everything seemed normal at first. His machines were beeping steadily, the lights overhead flickering slightly, as they often did in that wing. But something felt different. As I adjusted the fore-drip, I heard the faintest sound, a soft rustling, like someone breathing in the corner of the room. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty except for the old man. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. I was sure I'd heard something. Maybe it was just the building settling, I thought. I shrugged it off, finished my checks, and moved on. But as I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt colder, thicker. My footsteps echoed loudly against the linoleum floors, and the only other sounds were the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional distant beep of machines. I reached the nurse's station, but as I was passing a storage closet on the left side of the hallway, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A figure, a shadow, standing in the doorway of the closet. At first, I thought it was another nurse or maybe someone who had gotten lost. But there was something off about the way the figure stood, so still, so rigid. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague outline of a person. I blinked, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. The closet was empty. I quickly told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, the hospital was full of old, creaky spaces, and I hadn't had much sleep lately. But as I moved past the spot, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder repeatedly. Nothing was there, but I still felt that presence, that oppressive feeling, as if someone, or something, was following me. I tried to ignore it and continued my rounds. The rest of the night was uneventful, or so I thought. But when I returned to check on Mr. Thompson, the man in room 304, everything was wrong. The room was dark. I had left the light on when I went to check on him earlier, but now it was completely off. I rushed to the bed, but the old man wasn't in it. I searched the room frantically, even checked the bathroom, but he was nowhere to be found. Confused and frightened, I checked the hallway, but there was no sign of him. I called out for the charge nurse, but when I returned to the room, the old man was back in bed, just like I had left him. The machines were all back to normal, and everything was as it should be. My heart was pounding in my chest. What had just happened? I went to the nurse's station and sat down, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe it was some kind of confusion. But the unease stayed with me. I kept looking down the hallway, waiting for something to happen. The silence was too deep, too thick. The entire place felt like it was holding its breath. Then, around 3:30 a.m., the real horror began. I was alone in the hallway when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from behind me. I turned, half expecting to see a staff member or even a janitor. But there was no one there. I froze, my eyes darting from one end of the corridor to the other. No one. The footsteps stopped, and I felt the air grow cold. A sense of dread washed over me, the kind of fear you can't explain. Then, the lights flickered again. And this time, it wasn't just one light, it was the entire hallway, flashing in and out, as if something was trying to communicate with me. And then, from the far end of the corridor, I saw it. A figure. Not like a person, but a shape, moving slowly toward me. It was tall, but too thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its features were blurry, like a distortion of reality. It didn't walk. It just glided, floating just above the ground, its form shifting in and out of focus, as if it didn't fully belong in the space it was occupying. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I just stood there, watching as it came closer, until it was only a few feet away from me. And then, it was gone, disappeared into the thin air. I didn't wait around to figure out what had happened. I ran to the nearest exit and stayed outside until my shift ended. The entire rest of the night passed in a blur, but I never returned to that wing. It's been years since that night, and I've worked in many different hospitals, but I still don't know what happened to me that night. The experience has haunted me ever since. Every time I think about it, I can still feel the cold, hear those footsteps, and see that shadow moving through the halls. I don't know if it was the building itself, or if something truly paranormal happened, but I will never forget that night. It's one of those things I'll never be able to explain, no matter how many times I try. That's all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and that it gave you that little thrill we all love. If you've experienced something like this, don't hesitate to share your story in the comments. Let's see if we can figure out some of these mysteries together. And remember, sometimes the most unsettling experiences are the ones that stay with us the longest. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more spine-chilling content. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.